By midnight, the apartment was abandoned. I escaped into the night from that town, but not from myself. Hello, I am GD, your host and writer for Out of Context. This is my third channel update, and is intended to cover who I am. It's a long story, so let's continue. My memories of this time are a little mixed. My father moved most of my possessions into storage, and the remainder of my more precious items, including myself, were kept safe within one of his houses. A safe house, if you will. For a time, I considered this arrangement acceptable. My father's work was seasonal, and he was currently in the off-season. Additionally, my brother was living there. I was, for the most part, safe in these accommodations. But months passed, and eventually my father's seasonal work would resume. My brother left, and my father became busy. I was alone, again. Loneliness would normally not be a problem. I'd been dealing with it most of my life, but this wasn't my house, not my domain, and it felt like I had been entrapped. The house was infested with cluster flies, or houseflies. I'm not sure which. The house was isolated from most commercial services, particularly grocery stores, and access to a vehicle was limited. It didn't take long for my mind to break once again, but for now, I still had a plan. I took a taxi into town and took up residence in an inexpensive but decently maintained hotel room. It was about a week before one of my cousins, who lived in town, learned that I was looking for a place to live, and provided me temporary residence within their home, which was shared by other residents. My relationship with my cousin was strange. In our young adulthoods, we were friendly to one another, and yet I'm not convinced that such friendliness had any foundation for existing. Regardless of actions as a child, I had never had friendly emotions towards either him or his sister, especially his sister, and yet he seemed friendly towards me. If I had any reason to be friendly, it was to avoid controversy. But what were his reasons? It's complicated, I'm sure, and perhaps worth investigating. But honestly, I don't know. After my weekly stay and weekly rate at the hotel had expired, I stayed with my cousin for about 2 days. An opening for room for rent was discovered in a condo apartment unit, and I took it. The rent for the apartment was split 5 ways, then 4, and later 5 ways again when my brother joined to replace the missing resident, and I remained there for 1 to 2 years. The residents were students. One was kind, another was intelligent and charismatic, and the last, unknown. There was a fourth, but she was a bit ditzy. She didn't live there long enough for me to properly assess her character once I arrived. I had no income, and was living off my savings, something that I could continue to do for another couple of years. Initially, I occupied my time there cleaning the house, rather cleaning the noticeably filthy parts of the house. The residents were slobs, but still friendly, and had no issue with me doing the cleaning. I was confronted, from time to time, by the unknown resident in our house about my various activities, cleaning amongst them, and that did make living there difficult sometimes, like I didn't belong there amongst them. Eventually, I settled into my living space, occupying less of my time with cleaning, something I began to find more stressful, and more of my time with building my first computer, playing and recording gameplay, which I uploaded to YouTube, and going out for walks, especially with the intelligent and charismatic resident. IC, as I will call him, seemed very receptive to my communication, and during our long walks across the city, I would find myself speaking openly about various topics, including intimate ones. But generally, to my recollection, the topics were of a pretty safe sort, like concepts for a video game that hadn't been made. It was at that residence that I received my first kiss. Not with our resident members and not exactly in our house. You see, our neighbors had a tendency to party sometimes, and the upper balcony of one of our rooms made contact with the balcony of the other housing unit, with only a railing separating the two. The details are a bit hazy, but somehow I caught the attention of the neighbors, and they invited me over to sit. I did so, and ended up telling my story to them. I also told them a short story that I had written while living in my previous residence, from the town which I had abandoned. I remember seeing some of their expressions as I narrated my story, but I'm unsure as to whether they were shocked or stoned. Regardless, they seemed neither disgusted nor disinterested by my writings or my readings. With that said, I was surprised when one of the girls, not presently on the balcony, entered the balcony, from inside their residence, I believe, and kissed me on the lips. I was calm and motionless, attempting to assess my circumstances. I don't remember my exact verbal response, but I did communicate that I had never been kissed on the lips by a girl before. And my demeanor when communicating this to her was indeed calm, as I hadn't any reason to suspect or to feel malcontent from her actions or towards her in particular. She almost immediately apologized, as she didn't expect that I had never yet received my first affectionate kiss. Apparently, her reason for doing so was the result of some of our neighbors, not presently on the balcony, daring her to kiss such a stranger as myself. How I was picked out as a target for their prank, I will probably never know. Then, she did it again, but this time for longer and more gently. I still hadn't resolved any feelings on the matter, so I didn't resist and allowed her to continue as she intended. Apparently, she felt sorry for making my first kiss a poorly executed one, and resolved to redeem the situation by giving me a proper kiss. An admirable resolution, I suppose. I talked with her a bit more, and, if I recall correctly, reread my short story, just so she could have a chance to hear it. She signed my notebook with a message, and the night, more or less, ended. Time passed. The landlord decided to re-renovate the whole condo. It seemed that our rowdy neighbors, across 3 other housing units, had damaged the property, and while the occupants of our unit were unlikely to be contributors to this destruction, the landlord chose to evict everyone, perhaps in hopes of providing housing to a more cleanly bunch. I started looking for a new residence, and I found room for rent available. It was in close proximity, relatively speaking, to a place where I once resided as a child with my mother. My residence there would be the longest I had ever stayed whilst living on my own. I managed to live there for about a year before I realized that my savings were running out. I would need a new income. I wasn't ready to return to work, as I had yet to recover from my previous poor workplace experiences. Trauma, if you will. My father provided me with opportunities to work seasonally, and I did, for a time, take those opportunities, but even those became too much for me to handle. Running out of money, and fearing the consequences of doing so, I applied for a job at the same franchise as I had worked previously, but this time it would be in my hometown. I wasn't ready, but I felt I had no other choice. I was accepted in a grocery dairy clerk position, and, for the most part, everything seemed fine. But those same shackles I had acquired previously the ones that made me believe I could be fired at any moment, and that I must maintain a constant vigilance and perfect efficiency. Well, they had returned. But this time, my mental fortitude was much weaker, and I was vulnerable. Any mistakes I would make always seemed to overmatch my hard-working persistence. Whether this was true or simply my perception overmatching my reality, it became my belief, just as it did previously. But this time, I wouldn't manage to escape before my mind's collapse. The details are hazy, but about 2 years into my service, I started having episodes of unease and panic. It wasn't long before I turned in my resignation, apologizing for any inconvenience my employment had made, regardless of any confusion to the contrary, confusion from both the owners and managers. My mentality towards myself and the alleged perception I supposed everyone else had about me, it caused me to take intentionally harmful actions. I began taking long walks with the threat of never turning back. I began going for runs where I would continue to push past my stopping points, attempting to induce a heart attack. Most of the time, these never worked, and self-harm turned into self-care, if only because exercise is good for the body. But the intention to push my limits at the risk of causing harm remained. The only fear that persisted was that of harming myself in a way that was non-fatal, and leaving myself alive with injuries that further induced my misery. I was temporarily hospitalized for my mental instability and given medication, but the problem was never truly fixed. I would eventually abandon use of my prescriptions. About a month after quitting my job, I sought out mental health care and acquired a temporary government-paid income, eventually acquiring a permanent paid income about 1 year later. This did alleviate some stress, allowing me more time to focus on my self-recovery, but it still didn't seem to be enough. The remaining order of events is hazy in my memory, but as far as I'm concerned, these things did happen. I started getting spam posts on social media. I almost never investigated the details of these posts, but the comments they showed were almost never pleasant to read. In fact, the things they said were often terrifying to read. People threatening to kill other people for reasons I poorly understood, using logic that could target bystanders indiscriminately. And, well, it was just an awful mess. I wanted no part in their activities. Believing some of my acquaintanceships were responsible for this unruly propagation, I mass propagated a warning that all who were responsible for forcing me to view these things would be deleted from my contacts. I was labeled as a criminal by some, because it seemed like I was trying to hide the truth, as the people saw it. But honestly, I just wanted these blaring protests to stop interrupting my peace of mind, however much of it I actually had. And I just wanted these ugly things to stop pestering me. In the end, I decided that I should be the one to leave the platform, abandoning even my true friends, if only because of this incident. I began isolating myself further, even from my relatives. Video games were capable of granting me an avenue to exercise my mind, but I still feared the mystery of human evil. Multiplayer games invited this mystery as a challenge and competition, so even this avenue of articulation and release became compromised as well. History was repeating itself, and I was once again running out of ground. And then the final blow struck. My landlord needed to take care of her aging father, and my room was to become his living space. I was given generous notice so that I could prepare to move out. The obvious response to this change in circumstance would be to find a new place to live, but I wasn't preparing for this. I hoped that I would die in that house so that my nightmare of unending retreat would finally end. I hoped to die as comfortably as possible, and not in emotional and physical entropy. Eventually, I gave in to the idea of preparing to move out, but not to find a new place to live. My most prominent scheme, developing through my increasingly degenerating judgment, was to pack everything in my storage trailer, move the storage trailer to an open parking lot, and abandon it. The rest was simple. I would wander around until I died, either of exhaustion, starvation, dehydration, or hypothermia. I had reached my lowest point, and death was no longer a concept that frightened me. Even so, there was one thing that bothered me. Just like in my youth, I hated the idea of not understanding the reasons for things. And just like then, I couldn't help but feel like my situation would end the same way. People knowing I died, but not knowing or understanding why. However, I think my greatest fear was that, well, what if my experiences were repeated by others, and knowledge of my own progression could have somehow prevented or changed that outcome? Even when presented with opportunity to kill myself, especially through slow measures, my mind just wouldn't shut up. I knew there must be a solution to my problem, even if other people couldn't see it, couldn't understand it, or, in the worst of cases, refused to acknowledge it, refused to allow it. Because even if I must make changes of my own, I was not solely responsible for the resulting situation. And so, in order for my efforts to have lasting effects that could make my life worth living, I would need the efforts of others to help. But it always seemed like humanity kept interfering in my attempts to make my life better. So I had, to an extent, given up on the idea of life getting better. Regardless, I decided, for better or for worse, to talk to my father about my situation and the thoughts that had consumed me. My father provided me with a residence within which I could live and at an extremely low rental cost. I remained there for the foreseeable future. But this was not my home. Like the shaking limbs that refused to obey their master's orders, settling in was difficult, a slow process, and it only took small disturbances to further intensify my unease. Things are changing, for me, once again. The storms of my past are still there, still haunting. The memories, the emotions, my fear, hatred, sadness, and enslavement complex towards humanity. But these changes, my meditation and analysis of my emotions, have developed, and my comprehension has expanded. The future is uncertain, for now. With that said, well, for the time being, this is who I am. A being you may have loved, but also rejected. Someone who may have perceived your attraction, but feared the gravity of its crushing force. Who tried to fight for freedom, and was confronted and confounded by justice. Who tried to run with nowhere to go. Who tried to hide from the omnipotent presence of humanity through a child's eyes. Who failed to perform his human duties and prepared to face his death sentence. Created a world of death and of self-sentencing death to kill the parts of his mind infected by this incomprehensive, omnipresent, and omnipotent infection he would learn to call fear. Awoke from his self-sentencing slumber, alive and not dead. Sacrificed motivation and vigilance for observation, hoping that knowledge, now, would provide insight in a future he wasn't certain would come for him. Become consumed by a cycle of success and failure, only to be drained of hope and ambition. rediscover his objective, create a purpose, and attempt to find his place. Become confused by circumstances and consider himself a failure once again. And now, I conclude my story, because this is the part that has yet to be written. Where am I going? Well, I hope I have the opportunity to tell you what I have in mind. Forever forward we march. This is the final entry of who I am. With that said, this is GD signing off. Until next time. Thank you for listening in. Have a wonderful day.